Well, today's the 50th anniversary of the Kent State Massacre, which is pretty timely for this anniversary to come up, considering that it was a massacre of peaceful protesters who were shot by the government. Of course, back then, these were left-wing protesters who were protesting what back then was a left-wing cause, but today, would be considered a Russian bot cause, and that is, of course, ending whatever the current U.S. overseas war is. Back then, the leftists believed in that because, they were hippy-dippy type people who wanted peace and love. Now, the mainstream left certainly doesn't believe that. But a lot of especially the boomer left, likes to hang on to the legacy of the 60s. And of course, Kent State happened in 1970, but we were still in the Vietnam War, so it still feels like that. These folks, they were killed. There was never really any justice for their families. There's a pretty good article today on military.com, maybe I'll link it, talking about the sister of one of the victims. And how, 50 years later, she still doesn't know entirely what happened or why her sister's dead. All she knows is that her sister got shot. Why? They never gave her a reason. And, the fact is there is no good reason to shoot peaceful protesters. But why am I bringing this up? This is old news, isn't it? Well, as some of you may have noticed, that there's a lot of protests going on in America today. Although, of course, these protests are not associated with the left or any left-wing cause. Although in the 60s, I think this would have been a left-wing cause, and that is, letting people leave their house and go to work and earn a living. We've got all these governors that have declared police states, and people are resisting that by gathering at their state capitals and saying, not only will we not comply, but we want you to undo all of this right now. And sadly, it is the mainstream left, and I stress that it's the mainstream left because these are the Twitter resistor types, the absolute bootlickers who love the likes of John McCain and George W. Bush, but they hate the ever-loving God out of Orange Man and anyone who's not from a coastal city who, may or may not have enough money to make it by while no one's allowed to work. And more than anything, they hate these people who walk around carrying guns at protests. Who are trying to show that, Americans are not going to just take this lying down, that they are going to defend themselves if they're aggressed upon. Those people carrying around guns, that's kind of an implicit warning to the National Guard that, hey, don't try and pull a Kent State here because, we actually can fight back. We're not just sitting ducks. We're not a bunch of, schoolgirls just sitting out, on the grass at our university. They're telling the armed thugs who are employed by the government that, maybe you should pick on somebody your own size. And thankfully, that doesn't happen. We don't want there to be, gun battles between citizens and the police, although that has happened before in America. There was a great example of that after World War II. All the soldiers came home and they learned that, during the time that the war was going on and all the young men left the town, that the sheriff essentially had declared himself the dictator, suspended all elections, and was, turned the county into his personal fiefdom. And so what happened was, all of the soldiers who just got done fighting in Europe went and got their rifles, and they overthrew the sheriff's department. Now, had this happened in 2020, those men would have been tried as terrorists, and that sheriff would have been held up by the resistance. Again, so funny, they call themselves the resistance, yet they don't want to resist anything. And he was probably a Republican, or at least he would have been, in 2020, a rural Tennessee sheriff. And so things have certainly changed. We have this online Twitter mob that didn't exist, in past human history. But there's also, ways that can be weaponized for the good. Because if something like Kent State happened today, I don't think that they could sweep it under the rug as easily with social media. Because, if there's footage of the government gunning down Americans, the people that they're sworn to protect, and of course in the case of Kent State, these were National Guardsmen. guys who are supposed to, the theory of the National Guard is that these are the guys who, if America actually gets invaded by some other country, these are who's going to fight. Because, our actual army is always somewhere else around the world. So we need to have people whose job it is to just stay in America to defend this country, like what the military is supposed to do. But the point is, the National Guard is supposed to, fight enemies, foreign enemies, not college kids. And so if they try, if the government, start gunning down protesters today, I think that it would cause riots. Because even though there is a substantial, number of people in the population, a substantial portion of the population who would be okay with that, who have been calling for that, who have been saying that these protesters, they need to be, they need to be, whipped down. And I'm trying to use gentle language here. But really, every time you see one of these folks posting a picture of somebody with a gun, the hatred is it's quite frightening to me that you could hate another person who has done nothing to you, who you've never met in your life so much. But there was a similar phenomenon back in 1970 when the Kent State kids were gunned down. There was, especially after the 60s, there was a very, very much what Nixon called the silent majority, a group of people, a substantial portion of the population, who was tired of all these anti-Vietnam protesters who did not like them, who did not care about them, who thought that they, might have had this coming. And not these kids in particular, but the whole anti-war movement. I think that people who, were not fond of the hippies probably saw Kent State as retribution, as hey, you keep sticking your head up, you're going to get shot eventually. So just keep your head down and do what you're told. And I guess that worked out because, these were true hippies. These were peaceful people. And so when the government started shooting, they had no way of fighting back, nor would they. But if that were to happen today, okay, with all these lockdown protests going on, if just, one of these guys who are, guarding the Capitol, whether they be National Guardsmen or police or whatever, they get an itchy trigger finger, they're not just going to be able to mow these people down. They're going to be able to mow down most of them because the vast majority of people are unarmed, but there's always some armed folks there. I mean, I haven't seen specifically, but this is what the Oath Keepers kind of go around to protests to do, is they are improvised security just in case things get out of hand. And of course, the Oath Keepers, those are all ex-cops and military guys anyway. And if a situation like that were to unfold, I think that thankfully the Bubba effect would kick in pretty quickly, at least I would hope, and that eventually, assuming that the protesters were eventually subdued, and they start counting the bodies and they arrest all the guys who fought back. Well, actually, they'd arrest everybody who's still alive. That there probably would be another protest very soon after that would be even bigger, demanding that those people be released. I think that the image of American police or National Guardsmen gunning down their own countrymen like that would shock most people, because people really think that can't happen in America, that we're not like that. They think of cops and the military as superheroes, and I'm talking about most Americans, I think, even self-proclaimed Americans of the left, really do fall into that same category, just like the right-wingers. But I think particularly for the right, if they see what is characterized as a right-wing protest, people who don't want, who want to be able to go back to work and don't have the money to sit at home and are losing their houses and can't pay their bills, if those folks, get gunned down, then they're going to start to look at the police a little differently. And there's a very fine line between these, what folks would call copsuckers, people who have back the blue bumper stickers, folks who absolutely worship the military and police as heroes, as I've said. There's a very fine line between that and your red-pilled, no more Wacos kind of guy. The kind of guy who builds, a secret underground compartment, in the desert, or, has pipe bombs or something like that, grows his hair out. Preppers, people who don't trust the system. And I'm not exactly sure why that is, why it's such a sharp it's such a sharp one way or the other on the right. You don't have people who are kind of in the middle, like like on the left, to where they're like, well, I think that the people, our first responders are very important people, but what happened to that kid in Ferguson, that was so unjust. And so maybe it's because maybe the moderate left type folks have a bit more of a nuanced view on, well, is nuance even really the right word? I'll have to think on that. Maybe I'll do another video just discussing the psychology of policing, for the mainstream left. But on the right, I think that maybe the reason why there's such a fine line between those two extremes is because to them, these people, their status is so black and white. And so when they prop them up as heroes for so long, to see that a chink in the armor, to see that image shattered by them gunning down people who you think of as good Americans, that would just be enough to push you all the way to the other extreme. Because if they're not a hero, then what are they? They're a villain. And so that perception, even though that adoration is so strong, it's also much weaker. Because most right-wingers would never expect a cop to kill a good American. And so I'm not, with all this trying to draw comparisons between Kent State and today, to say that there's going to be some other massacre like that. All I'm saying is that it's always possible. Every time that you have a high density of people like this, especially when these governors are trying to enforce these lockdowns, although I think it's waning, but in places like, say, Michigan, where the governors are pretty aggressive, what happens if just, they decide to tighten down more, and they don't just gradually loosen up like I would expect? Well, then I think that if that happens, if any of these protests get out of hand, if you get any National Guardsmen maybe who are themselves resistors, who just kind of snap and decide to kill one of these armed protesters, well, then I think that would be a pivotal moment in American history, because that event would, as I said before, serve to red pill millions of right-wing Americans, and it would permanently damage all trust in the state that has been built up over the last couple centuries in this populace. That the docile nature of Americans, I think, would fade away, and that rebelliousness would be reawakened. But, of course, I don't want to see anybody get killed, so I hope that doesn't happen. With that said, if you gained anything of value out of this video, I'd appreciate you clicking that like button and sharing this video. And if you haven't already, please do subscribe, because I do upload every day, and I'd hate to have you miss one. So I'll see you folks back here tomorrow.